All right, so yeah, thanks for the invitation to talk and be part of this discussion, which has been yeah, really fascinating both today and the previous workshop. With apologies to the other speakers, I've given versions of this kind of talk before, and I tend to joke that it's likely to be either the most or the least consequential presentation that you'll see in the day, and that's because the main focus of this, which is kind of agentic AI, is something that if you are already familiar with, it's highly unlikely that I'm going to say anything to you that you probably are not already deeply aware of. And if you haven't come across agentic AI before, then as you'll see, not because I'm making a strong piece of advocacy for it, but because I think it's a direction of travel for where AI is headed and the implications further downstream, I think it's extremely important that you are. And interestingly, and I think this is probably because agentic AI has only really become a sort of viable technology in the past 12 to 9 months, perhaps. I remain quite struck by the fact that in quite in sort of digital humanities and other technical communities that I speak to, I'm quite struck that it remains a relatively small minority of people who are engaging with agentic AI, even if many more people are working with what we might kind of call chat-based large language models. So great. Okay, so this chart, again, one that many of you may well be familiar with. If you're not familiar with, is sort of taken as the kind of the classic example of why large language models and sort of generative AI in general is a moving target, and therefore we have the double challenge of understanding what these technologies mean for us right now in terms of the kind of the capabilities that they present, and importantly, I think as again relates to a user community and that community's kind of capabilities with that technology, but also where it may be headed, right? And so here, this chart, what it effectively kind of purports to show, and there's and at some level it does seem to kind of capture something, even if people want to kind of challenge some of the kind of the nuances around it, are the abilities of large language models to carry out tasks. So those are things which human beings can do, and the complexity of those tasks being essentially measured in time. And what it shows is that from the period of from 2020 to 2026, the capabilities of these models to conduct longer and longer tasks with success. In this particular chart, they show a 50% chance of succeeding. There are other charts which will show with a 80% chance of succeeding, and so on. But effectively, what we get is log growth, right? They're in their ability. So the complexity of the tasks, right at the top in the top right-hand corner here, you can see the notorious Claude Mythos preview, which is the model which everyone is kind of terrified can find security gaps in Linux and stuff like that, and has since been removed from public access by Anthropic, who produce it, is capable of working on tasks that an expert human would take 16 hours to do, but could do that in a fraction of the time. They also kind of point out at this point of the graph, their methodology starts to break down, so it's very difficult to actually kind of know for sure, but it's clearly much more capable than previous technologies. So agentic AI, what is the difference? The term agent is not a term that has a formal definition, but there's a sort of, if you will, emergent definition, and it contrasts with chat-based AI. So of course it was ChatGPT which sort of set the world aflame a few years ago by coupling a large language model with a chat interface, and the kind of fundamental mechanic there is a sort of iterative. A human asks, it responds. So it's a kind of time and about response. If you could get it to write code if you wanted to, but you would have to take that and then paste it in, say, to an interactive development environment or whatever it was you were using. And essentially, you are it operates within a kind of sandbox that you can put things into and take things out of, but is separate from the operating system which you might otherwise be using. Agentic AI takes exactly the same models that chat-based AI uses, so it will be Opus, or Sonnet if you work with Anthropic, or ChatGPT 5.5 or 5.4, whatever it is, or an open source model It's exactly the same kind of large language technology, but it puts that in, to use a jargon, a harness that effectively gives it access to tools on your computer. So agentic AI is the combination of large language models with those traditional tools that make a computer capable, in some sense, of acting in the world, right? The main platforms for this that you might have heard of are Claude Code and Cowork, ChatGPT Codex, but there are other software platforms, things like Lovable, for example, that also take this same basic premise, and these things are proliferating over time. And the idea really is that you give it some kind of a task, and then it plans around that task, and then it acts on the task, and it evaluates its own work, and then it will iteratively step through a process until at some point it's decided that it's either completed the task you set for it, or it's reached a state in which it doesn't think it's able to kind of to carry on any further and ask for further instructions. So it is a multi-step iterative process that's taking place autonomously. There are usually some kind of safeguards built in. So if given that it's actually working with files on your own machine, or connecting to the internet, say, it will ask you if you're happy for it to do those things. It can read and write files directly. It can run code. It can test code. It's extremely good at things like design, experimenting with the kind of the interfaces that it generates for itself. It can also, and we talked about multi-model orchestration earlier, or to use the jargon, the orchestration of working with different models, run teams of sub-agents. So you might ask it to do something, and then it will set off a range of different large language model agents carrying out different tasks, which then come together to produce some kind of output. It can interact with other models and software, and it can also be scheduled or triggered, so you can have it kind of come to life every 30 minutes, or do something whenever you drop something in a folder, or whatever it might be. So a very simple way of mentally separating between these two ways of large language models operate or interacting with these is that chats are in some sense conversational, right? I give it some text and it gives me some text back, and I give it some text and it gives me some text back. Whereas agents are, pardon the kind of the neologism here, collaborational, right? You want to achieve something, and you ask the model to take on some part of that task, and then you kind of collectively with the agent keep trying to move forward until you get an outcome that you want. So what kind of tasks can they do? At this point, really quite sophisticated stuff. So you can scaffold entire, particularly digital projects, entirely from plain English descriptions. It will write and run and debug code in loops until it works. Again, the top tier models now really are starting to be kind of equivalent, and indeed beyond even the most expert developers in some specific regards. Get the example of Mythos being able to find security flaws in Linux that over decades, right, people haven't been able to, software developers have not been able to kind of identify. So shows some of its kind of capabilities in that regard. They can work across different files and file formats. So that can be anything from plain human-like kind of prose in the way that our regular chat-based LLMs can, but also with HTML, CSS, Python, whatever obscure programming language you can think of, it can almost certainly work with. It's brilliant for revivifying, say, old databases on floppy disks, and giving you something that you can work with again. They can use APIs and data sources. They can fetch data, parse data, transform data, visualize data. And if you don't want to get into the actual technological weeds of what it's doing, at this point, you can now set it, and again, more jargon here, as a /goal, and effectively say, this is what I'm trying to achieve, and let the agent do the full process of planning out some kind of strategy for achieving that, and then executing on it, and then iterating its own solution until such time as it has managed to solve that problem, which of course should give you the fear of God if you worry about the paperclip problem. So the output, and I think this is something that again often gets lost in the discourse about the use of AI as we move forwards, is that the outputs of this may be entirely traditional in some form, right? It might be that it produces an entirely technical text sorry, a traditional human language text of some form of arbitrary length or translation or whatever it might be, or it might also produce some kind of non-AI software or interface, which itself to run doesn't require any further engagement with the large language model itself. So the large language model is only being used for the production of the software, but the software itself might just be a database or a Java program or whatever else that you want. Just to give you a kind of a brief idea, if you're used to using large language models as well, this is a little bit kind of out of date now, but if any of you use, say, Claude Desktop, you're probably in kind of chat mode. I don't know if you can see my mouse right now. So this would normally be the section that you use, and then down here you'd have conversations. If here in code, it looks very similar, right, to kind of a chat mode. You give it some kind of a prompt, and then you watch it as it iterates through its different actions and generates whatever outputs you want. And then on the right-hand side, it'll have various panels which will kind of give you information about what it is that's produced. Some of that obviously can look pretty technological, and if you have some kind of technical background, that unquestionably can assist. But what's really important to say is that it is possible for people with no technical background at all and just a little bit of persistence to produce really quite sophisticated tools. So to give an example of this,
sorry to interrupt. Just to say, could you start summing up just so that we can?
Yeah. I certainly can. So, A Tale of Two Cities here. So this was something I produced for a workshop a few months ago. This was a single prompt which generated an entire interface to sort of search through the archaeological records hosted by the Archaeology Data Service in the UK for Exeter. This is not, if you like, kind of wireframe, whatever. It's an actual interface where all of these links take you directly back to the records themselves. I generated one at a later workshop for Brighton, where it turned out in part that initial interface was easy to make because the archive already had lots of content around things like coordinate data and so on. Here for Brighton, they didn't have that, and yet it was still possible, collaborating, if you will, with the agent to be able to generate, say, kind of coordinates for postcodes, other kinds of spatial information, other kinds of temporal information in the record itself. So just as with Trevor just now, some thoughts to leave you with us. So functional agentic AI has been around literally for less than 12 months, but the capabilities have increased dramatically, and they're only likely to increase in time. So I think it's something that we really have to kind of consider the implications of as it continues to evolve. I think it allows for much more bespoke or disposable interfaces to collections, and it can be produced with limited and even no technical expertise whatsoever. And I think that really changes the way we need to think about the balance of resources, about developing interfaces for, how much time and investment do we put into the data curation part and the making accessible the data with the ways in which we present that. However, it's also worth saying that agentic AI is extremely powerful for both users and misusers alike, and it's really essential to think about the security monitoring of APIs and data to prevent the risk of hacks and data misappropriation. I think that is going to be a really significant problem in the years ahead. And lastly, agentic AI is very, or can be, I should say, costly compared to chat AI, depending on the model that's being used and the activity itself. And I think that also has important economic, social, and environmental downstream consequences. So yeah, I'll leave it there, but look forward to a few minutes of conversation as well.